All right, good afternoon, class. I'm finally getting around to posting some comments about some of the, uh, helping us learn a little bit and make some meaningful observations of the changing nature of imperial leadership, essentially the emperors, the kings of Rome, if you will. And they reveal some interesting things about the resilience, durability of the Roman Empire, and also some disturbing aspects of developments, and in some ways these leaders are going to perhaps telegraph or foreshadow the ultimate decline of Rome as a very impressive empire. And really the two groups that I want to point out, and I'm just going to give you some brief examples just to give us a sense of these two groups of leaders. The first is the Julio-Claudians. And the Julio-Claudians were a handful of leaders that followed Caesar Augustus, so the great, the foremost emperor in Roman imperial history, which also happens to be the first. He's going to be followed by some interesting leaders that we refer to as the Julio-Claudian line, and they include Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. And what the Julio-Claudians really reveal about Rome, I think, are a couple things. One, they were all named and chosen based on some basis of hereditary succession from Caesar Augustus and then later from one another. So essentially, hereditary succession means that in order to receive the Roman imperial throne, you need to be related to someone, and you need to be somehow related to your predecessor. Now, as you might imagine, that's somewhat limiting, and sometimes you don't get the best people for the job when the pool of people that you have to choose from is limited to the family members of the past leader or the past boss. And so that's what we have, and in many ways the Julio-Claudians do not, they live up to what you might expect, which is not a whole lot. And I could tell you stories about Tiberius and Caligula and Claudius and all these people. They're all incredibly flawed individuals in their own right, but perhaps no one is better exemplifies the depraved nature of the Julio-Claudians than the Emperor Nero. And he's going to be an important person both symbolically, and he comes along at a very important time in the history of the Roman Empire, and more on that a little bit. First off, Nero is going to be eligible to become Emperor of Rome, which he does in 54 current era. He's eligible because he is adopted in the final years of his predecessor, who is Claudius. He's adopted, which makes him effectively the son of the emperor, and thereby makes him eligible for office. This was actually quite common. Most of the Julio-Claudian rulers are going to be adopted, and that's what sort of sets them up. It's not, incidentally, it's not very different. Octavian himself, who goes on to become Caesar Augustus, was adopted by Julius Caesar in the final years of his life, which allowed him to select Octavian in his will as the successor of Roman leadership. But if you recall, going back to Caesar Augustus, he was always, one of his real gifts and one of his assets as a leader was that he was very cautious and almost apologetic about his power. He knew he came along at a time in the late Roman Republic or the early Roman Empire, whichever you prefer, where the Senate was very sensitive and very aware and concerned, anxious about their ability to remain in power. So Caesar Augustus, as the new Princeps, the first citizen of Rome, was always very cautious about calling attention to his power. Well, by the time we get along to the later Julio-Claudians, and Nero is a great example of this, the emperors are no longer apologizing for their power. In fact, they're embracing their power, they're flaunting their power, reveling in their power, and even taking tremendous advantage of their power. But along comes Nero, adopted by Claudius. His mother, Nero's mother, Agrippina, probably one of the most sinister women in the history of humankind, was very activist in the sense that she worked hard to get her son into a position where he could inherit the throne. She then played a role in killing her husband, Claudius, so that her son Nero could take power. There are fairly well documented histories that point to the fact that Nero had an incestuous relationship with his mother, Agrippina. We have to take that a little bit with a grain of salt, because a lot of the histories that are written in Rome during this time, it's possible that they are being written to sort of get revenge and change the historical record in a way that's damaging to people that historians didn't particularly care for. But nonetheless, this does not seem completely out of character for either Nero or Agrippina for them to have perhaps had this incestuous relationship. Anyway, the first few years of Nero's rule go fairly well. He's a somewhat dignified, somewhat ethical leader. He does things like decreases taxes for the Roman people. He reinstates some of the authority to the Senate, authority that the Senate had lost long ago when folks like Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus came along. He ends a practice of sort of secret spying and informing that had been happening, had been put into place by earlier emperors of the Julio-Claudian line. But something seems to have happened about 4 or 5 years into Nero's reign, because by the late 50s, he seems to turn into a rather different person. Starting with, he has his mother killed. He makes 2 attempts on her life. The second one succeeds. You could argue maybe this wasn't so bad because Agrippina was not a particularly nice woman. But Nero had also married, he had married the daughter of Claudius, which, if you recall, that makes Claudius's daughter. It makes her his stepsister, so he was married to his stepsister. Well, he will have her murdered by a new love interest that he takes on. Her name is Poppaea Sabina. Not a very nice woman, described as beautiful and wicked by historians of that time. And together they also put together a plot to murder Britannicus, who was the son of Claudius, the previous emperor. Britannicus was the son of Claudius, so the natural son and possible heir to the throne. So Nero, of course, has to have him removed. Nero was just, I don't know how to say it other than awful. He understood that he had power. He used it to its fullest. He was known for performing plays and music in the public spaces of Rome. He sometimes made the audiences stick around and hear him. Sometimes there was punishment of death if someone left his performance early. Stories of women who essentially were forced to have their children in the audience because they couldn't leave, because they had been kept there artificially by Nero. Nero had an insatiable sexual appetite. He sometimes killed people in the act of pursuing and satisfying his sexual desires. And finally, I shouldn't say finally, almost finally, in 64 current era, we have an important moment where Rome catches fire. This is one of the worst fires in the history of urban, the history of urbanization, large cities in world history. And Rome loses for 6 days. This fire rages, and there are fairly well-founded rumors that Nero perhaps was behind them, that he wanted to, rebuild Rome, and so that meant burning Rome down. We have the famous reference to Nero fiddling while Rome burned. We don't think that was the case. Nero probably wasn't even in Rome when these fires were taking place. But in order to deflect suspicion away from himself, Nero is going to go on and find this group, this growing social minority known as the Christians, the early emergence of the Christian faith, and he finds the Christians to be guilty and begins a campaign of persecution where he scapegoats, meaning he finds blame of the Christians for having caused the fire. Also knows that they won't renounce their Christianity, so he uses that as a way of saying that they are guilty and they're unwilling to, if they're Christian, therefore they caused the fires, and since Christians are unwilling to renounce their faith, somehow the logic goes that if you're a Christian, then you cause these fires. Anyway, he's finally going to be killed in 68 current era, and it's probably the best thing that ever happened to the Roman Empire. Things were starting to become incredibly difficult. You see the second objective here, noteworthy changes under the 5 good emperors. So now we move away from the Julio-Claudians, who were synonymous with all that was awful with Roman leadership. And now we get from 98 to 180, a period known as the reign of the 5 good emperors. And here we have a time when the Pax Romana is at its greatest. We have some very disciplined and ethical leaders. It's worth noting that by this time, all of the members of the 5 good emperors are appointed by the Senate. So we no longer have people inheriting their office. We have the Senate appointing people, and that turns out to be a really good thing. So some of the reforms that Trajan puts forward is he gives greater elective power to the people, so they have the ability to elect some of their representatives and public officials. Senators have increased power to speak their minds, so there's greater freedom of speech in the Senate and greater power for the senators to act. He abolishes the law of treason, which had been used by a lot of emperors before him to essentially punish their political opponents. Anyone who says things that are bad about the emperor get consequences or punishment. So this allows for a little bit greater openness. He also does a great job of contributing and supporting literature and other forms of art during his time, particularly building. Rome will extend to essentially its greatest extent under Trajan. Trajan probably ranks about 3rd overall in terms of the Roman emperors, probably just after Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus in that respect, and he is fantastically successful. He also dramatically contributes to the public works around Rome. He's instrumental in improving roads. He builds new roads, particularly in the provinces of Rome. He restores some harbors that had fallen on hard times at that point during the Roman Empire. Also connects greater water sources to Rome, so builds some aqueducts, new baths, and then probably most importantly, he makes several new additions to the Forum, which is the most common public space within Rome. And a lot of these have to do, these are things that are honoring his tremendous conquests, where he extends the reach of the Roman Empire to places farther east. Okay, so Trajan is a really important person. His architecture here, we probably have a moment where Rome rivals Greece during the age of Pericles. So Rome is looking every bit as good, if not greater, than ancient Athens. Our final member of the 5 good emperors is Marcus Aurelius. You've perhaps read part of his material, one of our primary readers this week. Marcus Aurelius is a dignified and ethical man who just rules at a difficult time. He unfortunately